You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast starring myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this show for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're recording and releasing all these shows for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. What about you?
I'm doing pretty well. This might be a shorter episode than usual. We are reviewing Pen Pals, Star Trek's The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 15, which debuted on May 1st, 1989. I don't know how you feel about this episode. When I viewed it the first time for our episode, for our recording today, I I enjoyed it a little bit more the first time than I did watching it the second and third time through. I found that the more I watched it, the less I actually appreciate the episode, even though there's certain parts of it that are interesting. It's not a great episode in my opinion. I think it reminds me a lot of season one structurally. Like there's a little bit of fluff to it, but there's not a lot of substance, I think, in either of the main stories.
No, I think that it's sort of a tight because there's just the two. The major story is Data and Sarjenka, and it's really I see it. After I finish, it's about Data and Sarjenka, and then secondly, it's about Wesley Crusher. Figuring out his first steps in leadership. Then when I went back after I wrote up my notes, I was thinking of, it was kind of sitting, running around my mind. I said, the whole thing about Data and Sarjenka and how the Prime Directive came to play into this, it's like a big morality play.
Right.
But it's like one act. It's very concise.
Right. Well, I think one thing that this episode suffers from is that it doesn't actually have a lot of big dramatic moments.
No.
It tries to build them a little bit, like through the use of music and through character interactions, but nothing ever really pops in this episode to make anything stand out. So before we dig into both storylines,
Sure.
let's get the audience up to speed as we usually do.
Okay.
So the USS Enterprise D is studying a series of planetary breakups in the Selkundi Drama sector. Planet after planet has been reduced to rubble, apparently as the result of natural geologic cataclysms. The Enterprise mission is to find an answer to this mystery. So we open up with the mission, as I just stated, but we take an interesting side route to it through the holodeck, where Captain Picard and Deanna Troi are taking part, or at least Deanna is going to witness, Jean-Luc Picard taking part in one of his favorite activities, which seems to be horseback riding. They use the holodeck a lot in many interesting ways throughout the show. I find this scene here to be very revealing in terms of who Picard is. Um, we really do see when he's in his personal quarters or when he's by himself, he really is kind of a quiet, studious man that likes to read. He likes to study things. But here we're seeing a different side of him where he really is kind of an outdoorsman and a little bit of a man of action. And, as you noted in your notes, he really does have this kind of romantic, passionate streak about him, kind of extolling the beauty of horsemanship, because the relationship between the rider and animal isn't just one of use or function. There's a mutual need between the two, and Deanna Troy notices that this is a very rare side to Picard she's seeing. Even going forward to have a very interesting conversation about Betazoid relationships to animals and how Betazoids really don't have much of a relationship with animals they, because of their empathic abilities, they get swept up into the passions and the kind of torrential emotions of animals. So they kind of go out of their way to stay away from them. But Picard, at the very end of Deanna's kind of extolling about Betazoid creatures, says, he's surprised because he would think that Betazoids would be more confused with the beast that are human beings, and he points to himself. I, I actually love this scene in the show. It's one of my two favorite scenes, and actually both my favorite scenes take place uh, in this setting with Picard writing. But what do you think about this scene?
Well, I just think I picked up on what you said, where um, Picard expresses to Troy the mutual need aspect, and he's really defining a need for himself because he does keep himself aloof as the captain and so on. He at moments has expresses friendship. He does that with Riker. He does that with Beverly Crusher when she's on board. Um, not so much more with anyone else. And
Hmm.
I thought that there was an interesting parallel where um, Picard's expression of mutual need for companion kind of fit in with what Data did with Sarjenka, because here's,
Right.
Data, looking for somebody out there. He's just monitoring these, old radio bands. He's basically become a ham radio operator,
Right.
and he finds this voice, and it's, pleading and so forth, and it's in need. So, you know, it just demonstrates that Data has that need for companionship and connection also, above and beyond what he has with his colleagues on the ship.
Right. I think that's a very interesting observation. Um, we often discuss the humanity of Data, the character, a lot on this show, and in many ways, this episode was intentionally written by the writers to be a Data episode. Originally, the producer of the show, Maurice Hurley, was enchanted with the idea of hand radios and just kind of reaching out into the void and hearing a voice. So he liked the idea of this episode, and they gave it to I believe Melinda Snodgrass, who wrote A Measure of a Man. But during the production of this, there was this kind of push by Gene Roddenberry to have a more technical story built around the Data and Sarjenka narrative, which is where Wesley Crusher comes in, because they wanted something more scientific and technical. And the director of this episode, um, Winrick Colby, actually later on said that he thought having to have the Wesley Crusher narrative and it being so technical kind of took away from the power of Data and Sarjenka's story. I, I think it's an interesting. I bring all that up because I think it's interesting that you highlighted that Data really is in this episode doing something that has no inherent value to him as an android, but as a creative, maybe humanistic, maybe wanting individual or creature. He's doing something very, very special, in my opinion, that kind of goes beyond his programming. He's literally out there just looking into the ether trying to find something. He doesn't have to do this. I think it's a very interesting quirk we're seeing in our favorite android. What do you think?
I think we always discuss uh, Data's search to understand whether he's human or how human he is, or because I think we've kind of come to the conclusion that the way he's built, he's actually human, and he's just sort of becoming a better human as he has experiences and thinks about things and learns things and um, uh, uh, so on.
Right.
And so it really does become a Data episode in that way, in terms of, it's like the captain says, you can't do this anymore. But then
Hmm.
Data goes out and pushes a little bit further. And, you know, whether Data's really good about managing Picard, but he kind of boxes him in and gets his way when Picard says, really key phrases like a loneliness inherent in that whisper from the darkness. And,
Right.
and it was really significant. And it's like, well, what really changed his mind, where Picard and the rest of the senior staff says, you need to cut off any communication with Sarjenka. So
Powerful scene.
Data goes over and plays a recording of her pleading. And immediately Picard says, um, you know, um,
I actually have the line here.
yeah, I mean, at one point, this is where they get into the thing about, are they part of a cosmic plan? What's supposed to really happen here? Are we supposed to save this child of this world or not?
Right.
And then, you know, Picard kind of dismisses it because this is just sophistry. And then, I get at what point Picard says, he says, "What Data, what you're saying is in for a penny, in for a pound." But the key thing is that when Data plays Sarjenka's voice, Picard realizes immediately the humanity of it. And
Right.
to hell with the Prime Directive. We're gonna have to help, and we'll figure this out.
So, to update the audience on what's going on in the story, so they have a little bit of framing to what we're discussing here, because we might as well jump into it. Um, because this is really a discussion of like the Prime Directive versus the reality of morality and ethics on an actual mission.
It's a theory versus practice. That's why I say
At
it's like it becomes a morality play.
So Data is, using the Enterprise as a hand radio and is communicating with Sarjenka. And while he's not necessarily breaking the prime, he's broken the Prime Directive, but he's not revealing like who he is really, or what the Federation is, or where he is in space. But he learns from Sarjenka that her planet is like the others in the Selknam sector, geologically unstable. And it's interesting that you use the term him handling Picard, because in many ways, Data, once he figures out what's going on, manipulates the entire crew
He does, yes.
into rescuing Sarjenka
He
and
does.
ultimately rescuing her planet. Um, I think the
He does a very very quiet, subtle Jedi mind trick on everybody.
right, you know, so
Did, I
one of the
didn't want to
key
bring up. I'm sorry, I didn't want to bring up Star Wars.
it's okay. We can I will lessen on that.
Yes,
Um, so let's get into it. One of the main plot points of this episode is this debate about whether or not they save Sarjenka's planet because they have the technology to do so, versus whether or not this breaks the Prime Directive. And ultimately, my opinion of that scene is that Data would have won anyway because Picard is the one who makes kind of some ridiculous arguments, in my opinion. It starts off with him saying, "Well, okay, first we save a planet. Do we save?" And then Pulaski's like, "Of course we do." And then he's like, "Well, do we save people from pandemic? I'm sorry, a pandemic?" And she's like, "Yes, of course we do." He's like, okay, well, what about an oppressive government or what about war, or a nation that's enslaving another? And he starts going down this list of all these things that like the Prime Directive keeps them from getting involved in because it does morally and ethically protect them by keeping them out of the fray of these very hostile and risky events that could really catch the that could catch not only the crew of the Enterprise but the entire Federation into socio-political problems throughout the galaxy. Um, but the first two, I think, are a little bit ridiculous on the notion that if you have the technology to save 1 billion people on a planet that's blowing up by literally launching 5 torpedoes into the planet's core, is the Prime Directive really that important? Now, okay, not getting involved in wars, fine. Not getting involved with an oppressive government that's enslaving its people, fine. Not getting involved in civil conflicts or elections or anything like that, or the advancement of a species technology as it pertains to getting warp drive, fine. I get all of those because the moment you interfere with those, you inalterably change their culture and change who they are, and you could do some real damage. But Data makes a really good point, and this is an important episode because this is the only episode that I know of where Pulaski goes out of her way to defend and argue for Data constantly. Like, if you know that you could save 1 billion people from their planet exploding, you do have a moral duty to do that, don't you? Or if you have a way to cure a pandemic, like,
Here,
don't you have a moral duty on some level?
here's an answer that came in for a company that I work for. Had a question about some technology related to potential treatment for blindness, and it's from a
Please.
gentleman. It's a gentleman who is, I think, oh yeah, he's a engineer from the UK, a consultant civil engineer, and he says he ends this. His questions is, when is this technology drug going to be available? Blah 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 blah. And he ends by saying, "Time waits for no man. If one has knowledge, then to hide it from the light of benefiting mankind is a moral sin." Now, I don't know. You may know. Is that a quotation from someone? I don't know.
I,
It
I've
sounds like
I've
it might
heard
be.
it before, but
Right.
you know, I I
And I
agree
and
with.
I think that statement is so concise. It's like that could be the answer to what we're considering now.
Well, I think it's something that Picard even realizes too when he hears Sarjenka pleading for Data, quote unquote, in the dark. Um, I think the I think the difficulty in this is on one hand you have a Captain Picard who is very rigid to the rules in many ways, but he's also a strict moralist. He's broken the Prime Directive many times before, specifically in the episode Justice, where he basically absconds with Wesley Crusher.
Hmm.
Um, though he kind of defeats "quote unquote" their god on the way out by arguing that you can't be rigid with justice. I think here the issue at hand with the Prime Directive in theory versus practice is that it really struck me, and Margot, my wife and Ben's mother, talked about this a good bit when we were watching the episode earlier today. You know, it really is kind of miraculous that Earth and humans and the Federation and Starfleet have technologically progressed to where they can stop technically what is the natural evolution of a planet. The presence of dilithium on Drama 4 is natural. The explosion of that planet and the breakup of that planet and the ultimate destruction of the civilization and life on the planet's surface is natural. But They have, but somehow they've developed the technology and the ability to stop that dead in its tracks. It's just science fiction, but it's a miraculous power akin to um, almost a godlike ability.
Well, here's two scenarios. One is somewhat practical and applies to today. You know, you can almost say that what the answer to the moral decision that Picard makes is to help this planet, and Wesley's work and his team's work applies into this because they discover the data and provide the
Hmm.
information as to how the planet can be repaired. Um, it's somewhat similar to you know the problems we're facing on this planet. I mean, right now you've got most of the world does not
Hmm.
have access to an effective COVID-19 vaccine or a vaccine for
Correct.
SARS-CoV-2. You've got climate change that is starting to cause demonstrable problems. One of the things we've talked about is water.
Right.
There's things that, if you're a nation that has the resources to provide the vaccines for those countries that don't have them, is there a moral obligation? Well, how far do you go? Do you get enough doses? Do you set up the system to deliver a vaccine to everybody in Africa, or can you only do it in pieces because of limitations in resources and money you
Right.
have? Now, the second one is, which is more crazy perhaps, but more mind bending, is all of our talk about the possibility of extraterrestrials, wherever they come from, whenever
Hmm.
they come from, observing us. What's their prime directive?
Oh, good question.
I mean, I would hope they would be
Great
smart
question.
enough to say, these humans, they're really screwing up their world. If they don't reverse some things, they're not going to be around. You know,
Right.
we can in a couple hundred years, we can terraform it for our species and we can colonize it and so forth because the humans aren't going to be there anymore. So if they have the technology to show us how we can avoid these problems, is there any sense of morality on their part as to when they might step in, reveal themselves, and say, idiots, stop doing this? And here's what you have to do to get out of this.
I think what you just described is more of what Picard fears versus what he's actually facing in this episode because he and Will Riker have this constant interplay between each other about how deep they're in it. First they're up to their necks and then they're
Right. Over their heads.
past their
Right.
heads.
Yeah.
And I actually like that signal
I
between
do
them.
too. I do too.
It's a good sign of camaraderie between them. They have these little things between. But when it comes to the question of your second scenario, I think that is more in line with what is Picard is trying to avoid because if we are destroying ourselves, it's a choice that we're making. And I think by the Prime Directive, they would not, if they have some sort of Prime Directive that's like the one Starfleet uses, they wouldn't interfere because, like, it's not their business. Versus, let's say, let's say there was a huge geological shift, um, or like the pole shifted, which has happened in Earth history before, and we had to suddenly figure out a way to survive, or worse, like let's say let's say the Yellowstone caldera blows. And at that point, like there a huge swath of the U.S. is just dead
Right.
instantly.
Right.
Um, I think that those would be the moments where, like, you could argue that if you're an alien, okay, we're going to break our prime directive and come in because the humans have no choice about whether or not the caldera blows. The humans have no choice whether or not the poles shift or there's a tidal wave or, a whole host of things. We have a choice in our environmental future as it is. Like, everything that we're doing right now in terms of the damage is a choice that we're making. Sharjenka's people aren't making a choice about their planet blowing up, which is why Picard's later examples of where do we break the Prime Directive? Do we break it for war? Do we break it for oppression? Those are kind of bullshit arguments to me because that's not what we're talking about here at all. We're talking about true natural disasters
You're,
on
you're
a planetary
you're
scale
making a good
versus
yeah, you're making a good distinction here in terms of when do you decide to break the time directive because it's a war or people induced climate change. Those individuals, that species, that race has responsibility for it.
right,
As so it's like, look, we can't, maybe we shouldn't fix this because they created it and they need to fix them themselves. Read an article today in New York Times about Haiti. Is the way to Haiti to get better is don't go in and try to fix it because no one
right.
has. They have to figure out how to do this themselves, which
Well,
is not
it's the
which is a little bit cruel, but the article made sense. And
well,
but it comes back
yes,
to real quick. If you're in a situation where you know a species, a group doesn't have any control of the situation, and it's not because of a choice they made or didn't make, and you have the technology to help them, that's where you can make a ethical moral decision to if you have that power to go in and fix things.
and the crew of the Enterprise has the ability to do it in a way that they don't actually have to interfere with the Dremons at all. I'm calling them Germans because I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't think
yeah,
I don't think we ever actually get a terminology
they
for
did.
how.
They did use that Dremons. That's exactly
Yeah,
the term
but like
you used. Go ahead.
they fire from space and no one sees the torpedoes. Maybe because they're all fleeing, but they have the technology to do it without anyone seeing them at all. The fact that Sarjenka's even there is kind of happenstance because of Data. Um, Well, the entire process of cooling the planet is happenstance because of Data. But this entire argument that we can't interfere. Well, you have a way of not interfering through your technology and still being able to do this. Um, I think I think the real harder thing is how do you really communicate with people if you do need to save them? Like if the aliens suddenly had to go, oh shit, their poles are about to shift. What do we do? I think the aliens would get in contact with us and be like, look, humans, we've been watching you for 50 years, and you're a lot of fun. And we want to keep having fun, but your poles are literally about to shift, and you're all going to die. We're going to stop it this way. And then we're going to go back to watching you and kidnapping you every so often. But we just want to let you know we're saving you. Um, I think Picard wants to avoid that conversation because, and I forget what the episode is in season 3, but I think there's a real worry with pre-warp civilizations. It might be the philosophical part of the show because philosophically the show does take a stance on this, but pre-warp civilizations seem to be superstitious to the point where if you show up with this technology, and even Sarjenka shows it a little bit when she's on she's on the bridge and even in sickbay. It's very quickly that Arthur C. Clarke's quote about
Hmm.
technology being so advanced it looks like magic,
Magic, exactly.
and
Right.
I bet you Sarjenka, she's on the bridge going I'm in the realm of the gods right now, and
Hmm. Hmm.
there's a brown god with ridges on his head, and there's a bald god, and there's a lady god, and then there's Data, my god friend. Um,
And Dad had just told me that he's not a person; he's actually a machine.
Jesus Christ, right? Um,
And
but a lot of those things can quickly build into something that inexorably alters the culture of that planet.
oh, look at perfect example is the story of the movie Stargate.
Oh
You know
yeah,
how Ra had it was an alien, but he presented himself as an Egyptian god, and these humans that he had, you know, kidnapped from Earth to create it as his slaves and so forth. There it is.
Well, I, the way they get around this, jumping to the next topic here, they after they've cooled the planet using the techniques Wesley and his team develop, they they remove Sarjenka's memory of data in the Enterprise, um, much in the way that's been purported to happen, like with alien abduction stories.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I find it interesting that in the future they are able to isolate the neurochemical bonds that make up memories, especially short-term memories, and are able to break up and eliminate those. What do you think of that technology? And from your perspective as a biologist and a scientist who's worked in medicine, if we are able to break down the neurochemical connections that cause memory, what else do you think that we would be able to do with that level of technology?
Well, I don't know because I have to say that I don't, I haven't studied up on neurobiology recently and so forth. However, I have read some articles whereby just as, and it's interesting, they say this in 1989 that memories in the brain are made of chemical associations. And the
Mm-hmm.
papers I've read recently basically say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Chemical associations between neurons and that sort of thing. So, I mean, that's an area as we understand, the biochemistry, the biophysics, uh, the metabolism of the nervous system more and more. It'll be interesting to see if something like that might be possible. I mean, could you, I'm just thinking of a stroke. Uh, a person has a stroke. You know,
Right.
sometimes that's a lot. It depends on where it is in the brain, but if it involves an area where memories are stored, if that brain tissue dies, I guess those memories are gone. If the chemistry is ruined and so forth. So it's a very interesting line of thought, but that's as much as I can say about it, really.
You know, I found it interesting because there's a lot of research right now into psychedelics in the treatment of PTSD. Um, the idea that you would be able to induce a psychedelic trip within a patient, and that they would be able to. I don't want to misrepresent this, but reprogram uh, their personalities or their brain patterns in a way where trauma doesn't affect them as it did in the past. We're actually seeing this now with psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, and in California they have legalized ketamine treatments.
Hmm.
Though with ketamine there's kind of mixed results. Like some people get real treatments, some people don't. A lot of them use it for depression. Actually, ketamine, where anxiety, depression, and even I think they've started to treat some forms of bipolar disorder with psilocybin. The point I'm trying to make with all this is that if you are able to go in the future and alter the neurochemistry of people's memories, in many ways you would have to do away with an entire section of pharmacology that's dealing with psychological illness. Because with this level of technology, you would be able to solve, I think, most psychological illnesses by reprogramming the brain down to a neurochemical level. The fact that Pulaski is able to remove memories means that you can also alter memories or build memories.
Well, it depends on like if a pathology is genetically based,
Right.
you'd still have to do gene therapy or something like that so that
But they
the
have that too.
the primary etiology of the disease would be taken care of. But yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah.
Well, it just opens up the possibility that in the 24th century, there's an episode where it's the battle where Captain Picard has a headache, and Beverly Crusher looks at him being like, it's very rare to have a headache. Um, I think one of the reasons headaches are rare in the future is because they have the technology to break down these neurochemicals. So, what I'm getting to and what I'm kind of bumbling towards, I think that medicine is at such a level in the future by the 21st century, at least in the Star Trek universe, that the idea of like taking Advil to solve a headache, it's kind of like Bones in the 1980s in the hospital, watching them try to solve kidney failure with dialysis.
Hmm.
Like he would probably look at those two little Advils and go like, are you barbarians poisoning each other?"
Hmm.
They just don't have to rely on pharmacology in the future, it seems. And I think that's very interesting because they have technology that can actually go in and manipulate our
When you're talking about
structure.
the ability to manipulate memories, it made me think of what we were talking, before we started recording, and uh, President Xi would love to get hold of that technology, wouldn't he?
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Well,
there's just like everything has a positive side and a negative side, and there's unintended consequences. Once you were describing that, I was thinking about it. It's like, boy, that could really be abused by an authoritarian government.
oh, our government uh, abused it. So, I forget what's called. Uh, MK Ultra. Do you know what MK Ultra is?
No.
So, MK. Okay, sit back, folks. Um, MK Ultra was a government program during I think the 60s, 70s, and maybe parts of the 80s. Uh, it's been a while since I've read about it, like years. But essentially, the government was using LSD and experimenting on military personnel.
Oh, I've heard of this. I didn't know what the name of the program was. Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
they were doing multiple things with LSD, not only brainwashing to get people to do certain things, a la like the Manchurian Candidate, but also implanting memories, removing memories, altering memories. The entire program was built around using LSD to try to cultivate either the perfect soldiers, sleeper soldiers, new forms of torture, new forms of coercion. And what they slowly discovered was LSD was not only not built to do kind of these negative conditionings, which said something interesting about the drug that Timothy Leary had been talking about going all the way back to the Harvard studies, that you really couldn't use this stuff for a negative purpose. Um, but it also showed that, like, you know the the Bourne books
Yeah,
by
I was just going to say Robert Ludlum. I said this is what they did to create a Jason Bourne. Sure.
basically MK Ultra was an attempt to create a Jason Bourne
Hmm.
ultimately, and it failed just because the government had really no idea of how to use LSD, and in many cases they abused hundreds of our men and women veterans. um, Cases of suicide, homelessness, murders, families being broken up, and a lot of these people were experimented on without their knowledge. Like this, it was in some ways not on the level of the Tuskegee experiments, but very close. Like our government does those kind of things too.
Right. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so one thing though that Data does, he leaves Sarjenka the stone from Pulaski's desk.
Hmm.
Do you think that that is a dangerous thing to do if a little girl wakes up with a singing stone in her hand and no memory of how she got it?
No, I think that
I know
action.
it's a souvenir and it's sweet, but like,
Yeah, I think that was more important to Data for him because
hmm
he knew that her memories of him had been wiped clean. So again, with him need to have that connection, he left her with the stone. And I thought
right,
about your concern. I think she'll wake up and she holds the stone and it sings. She'll think it's magic, and it'll be great for her. She'll, I, I,
right,
I don't think it'll cause her any harm.
right. Maybe I need to look at it from the view of a little kid instead of
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Um, So, you know, getting away from the Data Sharzenka storyline, the second storyline is about Wesley Crusher's first command and leadership experience. The story is set up where it seems Will Riker has decided that it's time for Wesley to actually get some leadership experience by leading the geological survey teams that are going to monitor the uh, geological chaos that is the Secundi Drima sector. Uh, I think the conversation that they have in the observation lounge, where Pulaski asks the question, "Are we raising an officer, or are we trying to raise a young man?" And they have this, interesting conversation about young people in general. Do you put too much pressure on them? At some point they're gonna have to deal with pressure. And Troy's really good about pointing out, like, the reason we're doing this is to give Leslie I mean, not Leslie, Wesley, the opportunity and lessons to build his self-confidence as a leader in the position he's one day going to possibly fulfill in Starfleet. What do you think of the task that they set for Wesley and the just motivating young people in general and how to what do you think about this setup?
I don't think it's a bad setup. I think it was a good debate they had as to how far they should push him and
Hmm.
to really identify what their purpose was, because they didn't want to be abusive of him per se. And with everything we know about the level of education that young people had at that time, I mean, Wes is probably what, 16 or 17 in this episode,
I think he's
and
15.
15. Okay, wow. So he's got some ensigns and lieutenants that are reporting to him that are probably as much as, you know, 7, 10, 12 years older than he is, which is,
One's a married couple.
yeah. So it gets into the whole, challenge that you have in any organization. It really shows up in the military a lot, where you've got a young, you know, out of the academy, out of officer candidate training, ensign, lieutenant, uh, second lieutenant, where they're put in charge of a small group, a platoon, a squad, or something like that. But you've got a non-commissioned officer who's been in for 12 years, for 20 years. And, the statements have been made before that it's, in terms of the tactical day to day groundwork, it's the non commissioned officers, whether it's sergeants in the Marine Corps and the Army and the Air Force, or chief petty officers in the Navy and the Coast Guard, who really make things hum.
Hmm.
The officers set the tone. They provide, what they're going to do strategically, what strategy they're trying to carry out, what the broad tactical goals are. But in terms of just getting everything done to achieve the tactical and strategic goals, it's the enlisted people and the non-commissioned officers that are doing the work. So I think it demonstrates that a little bit of that issue. Um, and I think they handle it. I think it's a good discussion they have about trying to balance how much responsibility they give them, how much they push them. It's a big responsibility, because at
Oh
one
yeah.
point they say that they were in the system for 6 weeks collecting data.
Oh
So
yeah.
this is a big job, and it's a lot of data, that they collected during this time period.
Actually, this is the first episode in a while that they haven't been diverted all of a
No,
sudden.
correct.
They're
Yeah,
actually out here doing a mission
they
for the
they
first
stay
time in a
they
while.
stay on they stay on task,
Yeah.
and then
Um
just and data messes things up, right? Yeah.
so one thing before I actually had a series of questions to ask you because you've been in management and you've been an executive and you've actually trained a lot of people and you've had to put together teams and you've had to organize committees and you've done a lot in the iBanking world. Um, what advice would you give to people in Wesley's situation where you are younger but you have to work with people that are older and more experienced? What quick advice would you give them in terms of that scenario?
For you to understand what you do know and don't know, that you have a good, honest assessment of what your current leadership's capabilities and skills are. And then number three would be to really work to understand the knowledge that the more senior people have that you don't have, and that what you need to do is channel that knowledge into a group effort so it accomplishes the goals that you're trying to achieve.
So, what would Picard do, basically?
What would Picard do?
At one point, Riker looks at Wesley and says, like, if you're facing these challenges, one thing that you ask yourself is, what would Picard do?
Mm,
And I
mhm.
think what you just described is a lot of Captain Picard's leadership style.
Yeah, I would say so. And plus the fact, I think the other important thing, in leadership is there's a balance.
Mm-hmm.
Where some leaders will say, well, they have to follow me no matter what. I'm in charge, God damn it, and that's it. And again, getting back to respect the experience and knowledge that others have, particularly people that are senior to you, but that you're in charge of. Again, you have to respect how those skills and experience and knowledge complements what you have, so that what you really have to do is, rather than just being leading all the time and pulling people to follow you, you have to be able to turn around and actually at the same time support them.
Okay, so
Rather than you being at the top of the pyramid, you need to be able to, like Hegel, flip the pyramid instantaneously so that you're at the leader 1 second, the next second or minute you might flip the pyramid around where you're holding the whole pyramid up.
okay. So to follow up on that question, at one point, and let me get the ensign's name because I don't want to screw this up. What is that ensign's name? Let me look at the cast. Hildebrandt, uncredited co-stars, Tim McCormick, Bennett. So there are a bunch of officers that Wesley interacts with. And at one point, he interacts with one ensign that he wants them to perform one test. I think it's an icospectrogram,
Something like
and
that.
and the ensign really balks on it and he's kind of supported by one of the other team members, where they're like, this is going to take a really long time to set up. And Wesley has this moment of real doubt that he has to go to Riker, and he says, I ordered this thing, and they balked. What do I do? Um, ultimately he goes back and he asserts himself and says, like, I really think we need to get this done, and his team agrees to it and they get it done. But in the real world, in your experience, when you're in a position where you might be the younger person or the less experienced, but you're still placed in that leadership experience, when you have someone that's older or more experienced that does balk to something that you think really needs to be done, what advice can you give in terms of dealing with that scenario?
Um, Discuss it with them, and then if what the subordinate suggests doesn't change your mind, so that you are self-supporting of the decision you made, you just need to thank that person for their comments and perspective. But you know, this is how the group is going to do it.
Do you, do you think that that comes down to the tone you use with them, or is it more a force of personality?
It's both, and and how much you use would depend on how much time you spent with your team, how well you
Right.
known them, how much well they know you, because you put it in context of whatever you know personal dynamics um, are extant within the group, and that's I think a little bit hard to describe because there is going to be what's the word I want, a power distinction.
Right.
If the one person's in charge, you got to put it in context that that person knows that they're in charge and that people working for them respect that. And
Okay. Um, Thank
it's
you.
real. It's really an art. I think. I think that's where the art of leadership comes in.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I think that thank you for answering these questions. I think that those were a lot of really great perspectives for people to consider, including Ben later on down the line.
Good.
So but before we finish up, let's clear up a few things. There's that scene right before Wesley goes into the geology lab to work with his team, where he's outside, kind of vexing about actually having to go in there and do the job, and he has this scene with Pulaski, where she catches him. I have to say, like, on one hand, Pulaski's great in this episode because she supports Data a lot, and it's really the only episode where she's truly decent to Data the entire way through.
Hmm.
But I thought that this scene was a clear example of it was the first moment this season where I was like, Beverly Crusher should be in this scene. Like this scene would mean a lot more if it was Wesley Crusher talking to his mom versus just some random person that he's known for, a handful of months since she's come on board.
That's a good point. Yeah. Hmm.
Um, Another thing, oh, the makeup for Sarjenka, who is played by the very talented Nikki Cox, who actually went on to have a very successful television career.
Hmm.
Fantastic makeup. Um, it's I think that it really harkened back to some of the costumes from the original series. I, I have to say, and I want to get your opinion. I really like the costuming and some of the designs and the use of color in the original Star Trek series a little bit more than the costuming colors used in Next Gen. And I was
Hmm.
just wondering if you had any reflections or opinion on that.
Yeah. I've thought about that. Yeah, everything is very subdued, even with a lot of the alien species or non-human species in Next Generation. Um, I'm thinking back that I wonder it's because the original series was in the middle of 1960s and everybody was getting artsy, and you had um, all these modern artists and stuff with very vivid colors. Maybe that was part of it, where they wanted to make it a little different and
Smoking all those
visually exciting.
smoking all those doobies.
That's
Uh,
right. That's right.
um, and before we go, I don't think that this is the best episode of the season so far. It's definitely not the best episode of the series. I don't. I give it, if there's a 1 to 10 scale, I give it a 4. It's not worse than the last episode we reviewed, but it's not any better.
I'd give it a 5. Yeah, I'd give it a 5.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, on that note, we'll call it for tonight. I think we've had some really great discussion here.
sure. Yeah.
So everyone, we'll see you next time for Star Trek: The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 16. Oh, we're going to be reviewing Q Who, which is the introduction of the Borg. So we'll see you all then next time. Thank you for joining me, Dad.
Thanks, Jay. Good night.
Night.